In this lesson, we're going to cover how to pattern components inside of an assembly. The file that I have open is called patternComponents.iam, and it can be found in your Chapter 6 exercise folder. So far in this assembly, if I spin it around, I have the base plate and I have a block, and right now this block is fully constrained. It's 10 millimeters in from each side. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back and do the pattern component tool. But before I click on that, I want you to be aware, if I slide on down here, there's also a rectangular pattern tool. Now they're very different. So rectangular pattern is going to be used to create an assembly feature, which will be covered in a later lesson. So make sure in this case that we're going to select the right tool, pattern components. And we have three different options here for doing a pattern component. We have the associative, rectangular, and circular. So we're going to cover all three in this lesson, but I'm going to start off by doing the rectangular. So I'm just going to go back to the component, and I want to pattern that block. In this case, you could also select multiple files if you needed to pattern them as well. Now I'm going to select the column. So this is very similar to the feature pattern that you have done in a previous lesson. So I'm going to go back and select an edge. I'm going to reverse the direction. And how many do I want? In this case, let's do 4 with a spacing of 15. And you can see I get the preview image. And let's also do a second row. And let's just put that at a spacing of 20. So we get the preview, so we know exactly what we're going to get. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. You'll notice once I've done that, I now have the component pattern inside the browser. Now each of these are an element, and underneath that element you'll notice that we have block 1. And let me go back and let's expand element 2. You can see that it's block with the colon 2 telling me that they're all tied to the exact same occurrence. So let's go back and let's find out if that's really true. I'm going to open up the original block and let's just shell out, make a dramatic change to this part. Go ahead and save that. I'm going to close out of this window, and you can see that all of the elements are all tied to the exact same file. So there's a couple of things we can do now with these elements. I can right click on the element name, and I have two options, suppress and independent. So let's first of all click on independent, and when I do that, you see that I can grab that file and I can move it around. The other file or the other components that I try to move them around, you'll see I cannot do that because they are all tied to the pattern component. So when I made it independent, you'll notice I now have a red X inside of the browser to tell me that this component is independent of everything else, and I can go back and I can do whatever I need to with that. If I wanted to, I could go back and delete it, or go back and reconstrain it if I needed to. In this case, I'm going to undo, bring it right back to where it was. And let's take a look at the suppress option. Again, right click, suppress, and you'll see that I have the line going through it, telling me that it's still there, it's just not visible on the screen. So now let's go back and let's edit the component pattern itself. And let's change the number that we have for each of these. So we'll change the first one to 5, and let's change the spacing to 20, and we'll change our second one, so we'll have 3 of those. In this case, let's change the spacing back down to 15, and you can see that everything was updated, and the component element that was suppressed, which is still not visible because it's suppressed, so in this case let's bring it back. I'm going to right click. In this case we will uncheck the suppress to bring it on back. For the next portion of the exercise, we're going to take a look at the circular pattern. So what I'm going to do in this case, I'm just going to delete that block because we don't need it for this portion of the exercise. And you'll notice I also have a hexagon socket part here, and I'm going to turn its visibility back on. Just going to slide that back down. I'm going to hit C on the keyboard, and I'm going to apply an insert constraint. between these circular edges, and we'll apply that. Again, let's go back and we're going to click on the Pattern Component tool, and under the circular option I'm going to select on the bolt, and then back in the dialog box if I click on the axis direction I'm going to select on the work axis that already exists inside of this file, and you can see at this point I can go back, I can change the number and the spacing that I want. As you can see, it's updating automatically, but obviously that's not what I want, so I'm going to change that back to 4 and change the spacing back to 90. Go ahead and click OK. Now if the number of holes change, let's see what happens to the bolts. So I'm going to go back and make that bottom plate the active component. I'm going to edit the circular pattern just by double clicking on it, and let's change the number of holes to 6. Click return to get back to the assembly, and you'll see that the bolts are no longer matching up to the holes because they're not tied to one another. So in this case, let's delete the circular pattern. Of course, I could come back and edit that and change it to the correct spacing to align with the 6 holes. But let's show the second circular method here in this case. So again, I'm going to click on the pattern component, and we're going to do the very first one, which is going to be associative. So the file that I want to be, or the part, is going to be the bolt. And then for the click on the associative feature pattern, in this case we're just going to select on the circular pattern back in that plate. It could also be a rectangular pattern, doesn't have to be circular. Click OK, and you see that the number of bolts aligns to that feature. So again, we'll go back and make one more change to that pattern of the number of holes. Let's change it to 8. Click return, and the number of bolts will match exactly the number of holes that we have in the original file.